Thanks for hanging out on a Friday with me. I'm Derrick MORTON. I'm the CEO of FlowPlay. FlowPlay makes a game called Vegas World. Vegas World is a social casino set inside of a virtual world. Recently, we've been looking at sports, and sports is really an interesting subject that you probably haven't heard much about before, especially here at Casual Connect. Pardon me, I put my glasses on so I can read a little bit. Much better. Because predominantly, casual games have been mostly geared towards, middle-aged women. So the first games that were Collapse and Bejeweled, and the key games that started this conference were all played by middle-aged women. So historically, this has been a conference of people who make games for middle-aged women. That's changing more and more, but I think there's a big opportunity in fantasy sports, and that's why I'm here today to tell you about a little bit about fantasy sports and why I think that it's ripe for casual game developers to take advantage of it and do something in the area. First of all, it's a really, really big audience. About 1 out of every 4 or 5 guys in the United States play fantasy sports of some kind. And most of them spend a lot of money to do this. Playing fantasy sports requires hours and hours of time, so these people are very dedicated to the craft of playing fantasy sports. And if you look around at the people that are making these games, almost none of them are really game developers. They're mostly guys that have worked for sports companies, worked for sports websites, who have put together some nice web pages, but they're really not what I would consider very good games themselves. And I really believe that in general, casual games need to grow beyond just where they are today. And I think by looking at what's happening in fantasy sports and sort of branching off into looking at making games for guys and games that are involved in sports, that there's a way to sort of grow the business and grow the whole pie that is casual games. So just a little background in case you're not familiar with how fantasy sports work. In the old days, people would gather around a table, typically 8 to 10 people, and they would do what's called a draft, where I would pick a quarterback for my team, and he would come off the table. Someone else would pick a quarterback for their team, and they would come from a pool of real-world players that were actually playing the game of football or baseball or soccer or whatever game. So they would go around the table, one at a time, picking players, and that would become their team for the season. Now, because these were based on real players, what happens with fantasy football or fantasy soccer or any of these fantasy games, over the course of the season, the results and the performance of the individual players impacts the team that you've assembled. So you could have a team that's assembled from players from many different teams that are on your team, but the kind of combined results of all those individual players makes you can put you in the lead and make you win the game against the people you're playing against. So the audience has grown dramatically over the past 20 years or so since this is launched. Today there's about 41 million people playing fantasy sports just in the US. I don't have data on Europe, so I'm sorry to be pretty US centric in a lot of the data I've gathered. The Fantasy Sports Trade Association of the US gathers this stuff together. And if you look at it as a business, you'll see that, I'm comparing it to the social casino business because that's where I'm coming from. It's about half as many people playing fantasy sports as playing social casino games, but you see almost 3 times the amount of revenue coming from those players. So they really spend a lot of money on a per player basis, and especially when you see the conversion. Conversion is super low in social casino. 1.62 is sort of an average over all the players in the space. But what's happened in fantasy sports is they haven't destroyed their business by introducing free-to-play. So almost all the fantasy sports people require payment to even play the game. So there's usually not a free component. That's one reason why paying over free is so high there. So in what they mostly play football. Football's the biggest one. You see there's also baseball and basketball and NASCAR and even fantasy soccer, which is football to you guys, I'm sure. But by and large, fantasy football is the #1 sport that's played in fantasy sports. It's what they look like from a different demographic point of view, pretty much what you would expect. It's a predominantly male audience, although in the United States we're seeing more and more women play. as women became more involved in being sports fans, and want to be part of what this growing movement. And because there is so much of the culture wrapped around sports, I think it's more and more pervasive and draws more women into the game. You can see that there's really a lot of they're playing almost 9 hours a week to manage their fantasy sports team, and watching about 18 hours of whatever sport they're playing to sort of keep up with it. So the NFL and the NBA and all the other teams have recognized what a great thing fantasy sports is for them, because it really drives their viewership up. So the more people that play fantasy sports, the more people that watch the games and watch multiple games, because they've got multiple players they've got to keep track of. Another reason why I think fantasy players are important ones to watch, important ones to make games for, is that they're more likely to play video games in general. They're more likely to play mobile games. They're much more likely to have a console, and they're twice as likely to have an Xbox. So this means that they're already sort of geared towards playing the games that you might want to create for them as an audience. So I think they're ripe for developing things for. So recently, there's a lot of buzz around what's called daily fantasy. Now, daily fantasy is a little bit different in that normally fantasy football or fantasy sports of any kind last for an entire season. You select a team at the beginning of the season, and that team you keep for the entire season, and eventually there's a winner declared at the end of that season. A lot of people, although this is a 20-year-old industry, have started to get a little bit tired of what's called now season-long fantasy, because if your team starts to do poorly in the early stages of the season, then you pretty much don't stand a chance of winning by the end of the season. So a lot of people drop out along the way. Another thing happened was U.S. law was established that allowed people to wager on the daily outcomes of daily fantasy. Now, the difference between daily fantasy is that you pick a new team every week in football or every day in baseball, so that you're constantly picking teams. Don't like the team you played with yesterday, the next day there'll be another game, and you can pick a new fantasy league team. So a lot more activity, a lot more churn. In fact, you could have multiple teams depending upon the groups you're playing with. So you could have one team you've chosen to play with a group over here, another team you've chosen to play with this group, and you can have multiple teams across dozens and dozens of games if you really want to.
Can I make one other distinction between daily and what's interesting is that it's almost like crowd-based, meaning that when you have the season long, which is what's called snake, everyone has to be in the room at the same time. Where with daily, it's sort of asynchronous because it's based on a salary cap instead of a snake draw. So no one has to be there. So it's like entering a tournament. So it's a big difference.
It is. It's easier that way because like she said, with season-long fantasy, you have to be there at all the same time. With daily fantasy, it's more asynchronous. You come in, choose your teams, come back the next day, and see how they did. So these market leaders are FanDuel and DraftKings. They've raised an incredible amount of money in the past few years, over $150 million between the two of them. There's a lot of heat on this industry right now. There's still some question marks around how big it's going to be, and if it can grow to really be as big as everybody hopes. It only did $100 million in actual sales last year in revenue. But for a pretty nascent industry, that's not a bad number. Really, like the second year that daily fantasy even existed. So 100 million is nothing to sneeze at. The reason why it's legal is there's a particular carve-out in U.S. law anyway that allows daily fantasy betting, so to actually wager money. So one of the regulations you'll see up here is that you can't have prizes based on the number of entries. Basically, you can't make a lottery out of it. So you can't have, every time someone enters the pool, increase the bet, increase the pot. It has to be decided in advance. This is a $10 pot, and 5 people are going to play. This is a $20 pot, and 10 people are going to play. So it has to be determined in advance how many people are going to play and what the jackpot's going to be. The winners, like with all fantasy, have to be decided based upon the accumulated play of individual players. So I guess the distinction here is you can't just pick an entire team. You couldn't just say, okay, for this fantasy football team, I'm going to pick the San Francisco 49ers, and that be the team I'm playing, because then you are betting against a team, and U.S. regulations are constructed in such a way as they want to avoid the possibility that there's corruption among the team. So that's why fantasy football is allowed, because it eliminates some piece of the corruption, because you couldn't just pay off a team to throw a game, because the results of fantasy are based upon the combined results of many, many different players. So hopefully you get why they're allowed to bet. There's how this really works is there was $100 million in revenue generated last year, but about $1 billion in actual wagers. So 90% of the pools go to the players, about 10% of the pools go to the people that are operating the daily fantasy leagues. One note, if you're going to make one of these games, to be a little bit careful about how you use the images of players. There's lots of regulations around having a player be associated with your game and have the appearance that they may be endorsing your game. So make sure that anytime you have an image of a player, that that it's in the context of the game itself, and that it's in the context of the statistics for that player. Otherwise, one thing to avoid is you never want to have like a player's image on your homepage, or player's image that's not part of the game itself, because then you're making the appearance that that player is actually endorsing your game, and you'll be fined and you'll be sued. So why should you guys care about this? It's a massive market, and like I say, if you look at some of these games, they're super simple, and it's obviously weren't made by game designers and game developers. And I think that the people in this room and the people in this conference can bring a lot to bear to really make more creative ways of addressing how people play these games and take advantage of what is actually a really massive market. Daily fantasy today, some of the things you may want to take a look at there are problems around it. All the daily fantasy games today require you to pay to play. So it creates a super tight funnel. So people that come to the homepage of a daily fantasy site to check it out, 80% of them are going to leave, and only 5% of them are going to actually put down a credit card to make a wager. So super tight funnel. So I think that there's a way to create a free-to-play version of daily fantasy that's not been done yet. There's what I call a sharks and minnows problem with daily fantasy. There are people that are, with any skill-based game, you have people that figure it out how to win the game, and then they take advantage of the people that are new and don't know how to win the game yet. So you have people that have win-loss records of 750 wins to 5 losses that are there every day making a living playing these games, and people that are new that don't know, that are just trying it out and think it might be fun to win some money in a fantasy game, get their clock cleaned after 10 or 12 games and are gone and don't play anymore. So one thing that daily fantasy has to figure out, or maybe the people in this room can figure out, is how to get rid of this, how to make it fair to the new players. So it's funny that for 20 years, season-long fantasy was the thing, and all of a sudden it took 20 years for daily fantasy to come along. Well, I think that there's many more milestones that are yet to come along the way to create innovation in this field. Daily fantasy just happens to be the one that came around about 2 years ago, but I think there's going to be more and more of this stuff as people figure out other ways to address this market and other ways to create games for it. Right now, the dominant players are real dinosaurs, and they're not interested in bringing any kind of innovation to the market. So I think when you have that kind of situation, small developers can do some really incredible things to be more creative and to bring great products to market. As I'm aware, I've looked around and I really couldn't find a breakout Facebook game or really social game that would use sports besides some of the yes.
Facebook won't allow it except if you're DraftKings or FanDuel.
Really? Well, in daily fantasy, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, just in even sort of like light fantasy games in general, the only thing that I could find that was popular on Facebook were team management games, but they're even sort of like the fake team management games. They're not even real teams. So I'm not sure why that is. That's why I have a question mark about it. Like, it really seems like somebody could be able to crack the social game market when it comes to sports.
There was one company, and it was recently acquired, and I forgot the name. I believe they presented here like 2 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
had gotten a huge amount of traction, but outside of that, I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, there's not that many. But that being said, investors are laser focused on this market right now. So a couple, probably 6 VCs have invested in the market so far. But when 6 VCs put their money somewhere, 100 others are looking for ways to take advantage of that as well, and wondering how they can get involved. Some of the challenges are the distribution channels are tight because most of the sports players today that are playing fantasy are already have their favorite site to go to. They're already going to CBS. They're already going to Yahoo. They're going to their favorite spot. Trying to find them and pull them into your game could be difficult. Obviously, we all have our favorite business contacts in the casual game industry. If you're getting into a sports game, you're going to need a new set of business contacts, and that's not always easy to do. My understanding is that the acquisition cost of sports players is a little higher than your typical casual gamer, but as you saw, your revenue per player is going to be about triple what you'd see in a typical casual game. The DNA of your team is going to be important. You may not have people that are currently developing with you that kind of get sports and are excited about it. So you need to develop that DNA to really create a great sports game, I believe. So here's some free ideas. Excuse me. Make a better daily fantasy. So right now, I think daily fantasy, everybody's making the exact same daily fantasy game. So there are a dozen different players and 2 major players, but all of them have essentially the exact same game with the exact same game mechanic. I think there's other ways you could probably look at the same sort of legal restrictions that allow people to bet on daily fantasy, but do it in a different way. Nobody's doing head-to-head drafts now. They are doing asynchronous drafts, but there's no reason you couldn't do head-to-head draft as well. And I think head-to-head draft would be more likely to avoid some of the sharks and minnows issue that I addressed earlier with people taking advantage of new players. I really think somebody could make a great Hearthstone game, style game out of a sports cards. I think that would be amazing, and I don't know why anybody's not done that yet. So give that a shot. Nobody's really bringing the power of the social graph, like we mentioned earlier, capitalizing on places like Facebook to make social games that use sports. And because most of the sites require payment before you can even play, I think bringing some of the free-to-play skills that people in this room have would help broaden the audience as well. Well, what we're doing, in September we launched a sportsbook, so you can bet a virtual currency, and inside of Vegas World, you can bet on any outcomes of Premier Soccer, NFL before the Super Bowl is on, in NBA right now. In fact, we had 72 different side bets you could bet on the Super Bowl and on Vegas World. That's just what our interface looks like for you to select your winner. We're engaged now in building a sports MMO. So it's a virtual world all about sports with sportsbook, hybrids of casino and sports games, and themed rooms where sports fans can hang out and talk about sports. Here's some of the providers of the stats that I had. If you guys want to find out more about fantasy sports and find out more data, these are the 3 organizations that provided a lot of the stats I pulled into this. That's it. Appreciate it.
Thank you. The way that casino manufacturers moved into social casino space,
Yeah.
do you get a sense that perhaps the actual leagues themselves will move deeper and deeper into these fantasy games, the way that maybe Major League Baseball has already done, even though they're not asking for money up front, they're doing it more as an engagement technique?
Yeah, I think, probably up until a couple of years ago, all the leagues were scared of anything that just smelled of betting. But you've seen Major League Baseball come in and actually condone daily fantasy and become part. Is it DraftKings that they're lined up with today? I forget which one it was.
I'm not sure, but they, on their own MLB.com,
Yeah.
they have their Beat the Streak and daily participation games as well.
And I think, as I mentioned, that what they've seen is that the people who play fantasy sports and the people who play daily fantasy watch much more sports on television than anybody else, and so they see their ratings go up. So it's only natural for them to make. They know they're going to make more money the more people that play fantasy. So they're incentivized to support the sport.
And probably the biggest losers here are going to be Yahoo and CBS. As things kind of shift, do you think that it's perhaps too late for them to even shift into this market?
I think so. I think because they're kind of dinosaurs. They're big companies. They don't move fast. They're not very creative. Certainly Yahoo's lost its edge. CBS, and most of these companies outsource the work too. They don't even do it themselves. So when you've got the big portals as the idea guys, you're screwed to begin with.
So I think one thing that is really important to be said is that daily fantasy only represents 2% of the market right now, and obviously that's going to be poised to grow as there's new iterations and new versions. And I agree with you with all the problems about where I think the current daily fantasy market is, dependence on liquidity, big guarantees. DraftKings still has a ton of overlay, meaning they're not meeting the guarantees that they're promising the players, so not enough players are showing up to every market. But still those big portals are the ones that dominate the market right now. The regulation of where it's going with daily is a little, everyone's a little scared. So companies like ESPN, CBS, they're jumping in from season to monthly now, some of them going even weekly, not going quite to daily yet. I think that'll take time. I think you'll need to see enough time transpire and the regulations sort of clarify themselves. A bunch of states have issued legislation clarifying whether fantasy is a game of skill or not. Some states are trying to ban it. About 6 are saying no. A lot of those that are banning it are now coming around and saying, wait, we got to regulate it. So it just needs a little bit of clarification before you see the big media companies wanting to jump in to something because they're scared about it looking like another activity that is not legal.
They've been using fantasy sports mostly as a source of advertising.
The leagues?
So
the CBS guys. Well, no, actually, they collect lots of money in league fees. So that what was it, 14 billion there or something? Hold on, so I get this right. Yeah, the 4.6 billion. A lot of that is league fees paid to people like Yahoo and to CBS Sports.
So what are you doing?
What's that?
How are you going to take advantage of this?
For us, we don't believe anybody's really taken a massive multiplayer approach to it yet. We think that what's missing in the market is a community. Naturally, sports fans love to talk about sports, love to chat about sports, love to be around other sports fans. So we think creating a community around it is a natural for us because that's what we do well. But we also think there's some hybrid games we can make where we can combine casino elements and sports elements together to make hybrid games.
And are you going to put it through your portal on FlowPlay, on Vegas World?
No, well, Vegas World is really, it's focused on slots and focused on middle-aged women as a demographic. So we're going to break out an entirely new product called Sports World to build it there.
Great. I think we're out of time anyway.
Okay.
Are we done?
Great.
Well, thank you. Interesting.
Thank you.